wise.
Welcome to FCPA Flash, the official podcast of FCPA Professor and moderated by Professor Mike Koehler. FCPA Professor is the leading source of daily FCPA news and commentary and the most authoritative source for those seeking to understand and apply the FCPA. To learn how FCPA Professor can elevate your FCPA knowledge, please visit www.fcpaprofessor.com. FCPA Flash is sponsored by the Red Flag Group. The Red Flag Group manages your integrity and risk profile, turning compliance into a competitive advantage. The Red Flag Group assists companies in developing and maintaining efficient and effective corporate governance and compliance programs and has a proven track record in providing integrity due diligence investigations in 194 countries.
Welcome to FCPA Flash. I am Professor Mike Koehler, and for this episode, I'm pleased to be joined by Paul Pelletier. Mr. Pelletier is a member of the law firm Mintz-Levin in Washington, D.C., and prior to joining that firm was a longtime DOJ prosecutor, including at the DOJ's fraud section. Welcome, Mr. Pelletier, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate you having me on your first or your inaugural podcast.
Thanks for joining us. Now, the reason I wanted to talk to Mr. Pelletier today is he's written some excellent pieces recently about the DOJ's FCPA enforcement program. And I guess my first question is, prior to getting into the specifics of some of these recent writings, what motivated you to take a public, what some might call a critical stand regarding various aspects of the DOJ's FCPA unit?
Well, Mike, I think that I think that I have a unique perspective. I think I had what some might call a bird's eye seat to the growth of the FCPA unit in the fraud section over the past 15 years. Almost 10 of those were I spent in the fraud section. As you may or may not know, I came to the fraud section in 2002 as the corporate fraud task force was heating up. And at the time I arrived in the fraud section back in 2002, the FCPA unit had essentially two people in it. Peter Clark was running the FCPA program at the time, and he had maybe one and a half FTEs or prosecutors working the cases. From that, we grew, the fraud section grew, but the FCPA unit grew a little bit. At first, after Mark Mendelson began running the unit, we grew, I think, to 5 or 6 people. By the time Chuck DuRoss took over as deputy chief of the fraud section's FCPA unit, I think we were up to 10 prosecutors when I left in 2011. Since that point in time, it's even grown more exponentially, and it's doubled in size. So I think my perspective is probably unique in both I've been able to look at it from inside, and then I've had the view on the outside as well for a number of years now. And so I thought that I think that when you say critical, yes, I think I have been somewhat critical, but I try and be when you say critical, I think I try to offer constructive criticism and provide, hopefully some helpful direction to the people in the criminal division.
And there's no doubt that you have a unique insight, and what I particularly enjoy about your writing and your commentary, as well as some other former DOJ and FCPA officials, is the insight you have from the inside, so to speak, and the benefit of the internal knowledge, and then seeing in your current private practice, being able to view it that way. And to be sure, when I said critical, I did, in fact, mean constructive criticism, because I think a lot of people, myself included, who are active in this space, do believe the FCPA is a fundamentally sound statute, and and do all share in the goal of reducing bribery and accomplishing some of the objectives of the FCPA. Now, one of the pieces you did write, and I would encourage all listeners to look this up because I think it's an excellent piece, was an op-ed piece you wrote for the Wall Street Journal in April of 2015 titled "The Foreign Bribery Sinkhole at Justice." And you had some follow-up writings on the same subject to that article, in which you stated, when it comes to resolving FCPA enforcement actions, quote, simply put, the DOJ can and must do better. Can you elaborate what you meant by that statement and perhaps provide some further specifics for how the DOJ must do better and why it must do better in this area?
Sure. I'd be happy to, Mike. So why I said that? Well, as I told you, that I've seen the FCP unit grow over the years, and I've seen sort of the struggles that we've had in the FCPA unit in terms of gaining momentum, in terms of acquiring resources, in terms of acquiring agents to actually work the cases. And thanks to the work of the good people in the Department of Justice, we were able to begin, I think, to become more and more effective in the FCPA space, both, number one, in terms of prosecuting business entities that were involved in it, and then eventually, when we got sufficient resources, prosecuting individual culpable executives that I think is important in the whole dynamic of law enforcement and being effective and making an impact. We did it, as I said earlier, under the guise of sort of the model set forth by the Corporate Fraud Task Force, which was real-time prosecutions. And what sort of, as I began to practice here on the outside and as a casual observer and both a non-casual observer in the FCPA space, it became increasingly clear to me that the duration of the FCPA investigations was becoming elongated, if you will, and to the point where I thought it was starting to become harmful to the program. And when I say harmful to the program, I mean that the duration became so long in these investigations that I thought that the detractors would sort of get a leg up on the Department of Justice, because I thought that the statistics were showing that the penalties that both the employees and the shareholders were paying in the form of costs during the lengthy FCPA investigations were becoming staggering. And so that's sort of the angle that I was trying to take, because I thought that it was unreasonable in some sense for cases on average to drag on as long as they were.
Yeah. And just for the listener's benefit, if you do dig into the details of many, not all, but many corporate enforcement actions, you'll see that, the alleged conduct took place in many cases 5 to 6, in some cases 7 to 10 years prior to the enforcement action, and the period of scrutiny that the company was under in many cases is 4 to 5, and sometimes longer years. Now, what do you see as really the policy ramifications of that? Is long, protracted law enforcement, effective? Does it send as best of a deterrent message as swift law enforcement? What do you see as some of the policy objectives there?
I tried to, after the Wall Street Journal piece, I wrote another piece in the Westlaw White Collar Crime Journal, where I tried to further elaborate sort of on what I saw were the problems. And you just said in your question, what's the problem with law enforcement when it takes so long? And my view is that at some point in time it doesn't become law enforcement anymore, because part of law enforcement, in my view, is to operate in a way that you will be able to provide what I always thought was important, and it's a concept known as restorative justice. And part of restorative justice is to let the public know, number one, that you're dealing with a criminal issue and that you're dealing with it promptly and properly. And number two, from the context of the corporations out there, corporations, for the most part, want to, particularly corporations that are publicly traded, they don't want to engage in bribery, or if they do engage in bribery, they want to fix it. So the longer you wait from when the criminal acts occur to sort of restore the company to where it needed to be through effective law enforcement, then your message becomes muddled and ineffective. And I don't think it's any surprise that real-time enforcement, even in the white-collar arena, is something that people perceive as being effective. And once you start bringing investigations, like you said, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years after the criminal events, you really are losing your ability to have what I call an effective law enforcement impact. And I think that that anybody who has been involved in law enforcement for any length of time understands and realizes that.
Yeah, and another spot-on observation you made in that longer piece you mentioned was that companies are monitoring, obviously, the flow of FCPA enforcement activity, particularly with companies in the same industry. And indeed, there have been FCPA internal investigations launched based upon general counsel and other compliance professionals reading information in the enforcement actions. So another point you made in the article, and rightly so, was by having these long-delayed investigations, it is not allowing companies who aren't necessarily under scrutiny to learn of potentially problematic schemes or common practices until much later after the fact.
When it's too late to do anything.
Yeah, too late to do anything. Switching gears, perhaps, but in connection with the same article, you wrote about an issue that has really generated a lot of commentary recently, and that's the investigative cost of many instances of FCPA investigations. Last summer, Assistant Attorney General Leslie Caldwell talked about we're not expecting companies to, quote, boil the ocean when it comes to FCPA investigations. But yet you wrote in this article that, and quoting here, the staggering investigative costs of FCPA investigations, which of course are ultimately borne by employees and shareholders, can reach unconscionable levels. And indeed, in many of these instances, some rather eye-popping numbers. Now, in your opinion, who's responsible for this, recognizing that the blame, if it is indeed something to blame someone for, may be shared? Is this the DOJ's fault, counsel's fault, the company's fault, a combination of both? What do you see from your perspective?
Well, first of all, when I was in the DOJ, I can tell you for sure that sometimes it was our fault, sometimes it was the company's fault, and sometimes it was a combination of both. And I think that ascribing fault is probably not the best way to tackle the problem. I think that in the same speeches where AAG Caldwell has talked about not boiling the ocean, she's also recognized that the way to sort of ameliorate some of the issues, regardless of whose fault they are, is through an open dialogue between the prosecutors and the defense attorneys, or the attorneys for the company, during the process, about expectations and about sort of setting forth timelines for when the cooperating company will provide information and sort of helping to get to the end at a much more expedient time period. Because at the end of the day, it's the government that's in the driver's seat. And it's the government that is in control no matter what you say. They're the ones who essentially have the finger on the pace of the investigation, and they can demand, reasonably demand, adherence to certain reasonable timelines. So I think that no matter who you ascribe fault to, because I think in a case-by-case analysis, it's hard to figure out or to ascribe fault. But I do think that the Department of Justice is the one in charge here, and I do think that at the end of the day, that when the investigative costs become so exorbitant that they dwarf the criminal penalties for the crimes that are set forth in Chapter 8 of the Sentencing Guidelines, to me, you're providing manna from heaven to the detractors. And these are the things that are going to assist the detractors in attacking and putting chinks in the FCPA armor that I think are probably are maybe unwarranted, but it's going to be the launching pad for the detractors to gain traction in Congress for attacking the FCPA statute as it stands. And I just think that that's something that's in the control of the department, and they need to fix it.
Calculating pre-enforcement action professional fees and expenses is not possible in all cases. Certainly with privately held companies, you're probably not going to know what they're spending. And even as to publicly traded companies, not all publicly traded companies are disclosing what they're spending on the investigations. But where one can run an analysis, what one often finds is that, as you sort of suggested, that the settlement amount is actually not the most or the biggest hit to the company in their investigation. It's usually the investigative costs, sometimes by a margin of 3, 5, 7, sometimes larger than the settlement cost. And the point you raise is obviously an excellent point when it comes to sort of the policy ramifications of this, and at least the perceptions of this. Related to that question is what I and some other people have called the where else question, the notion that, okay, if a company is under scrutiny for originally, let's say, its conduct in China, what one sees in the resolution documents when the DOJ or SEC for that matter is talking about the company's cooperation and remedial actions is that the company, for the most part, did a worldwide review of its investigations, and that's a lot of times where these investigative fees easily accumulate. Do you have any guidelines or suggestions for when this so-called where else question is appropriate, and conversely, this where else question may be a bit overreaching, whether that overreaching is motivated by counsel or by the DOJ?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very difficult question, and all I can tell you is that in terms of guidelines, each case is different, of course, and what I can say is that the more experienced the prosecutor, the more well-trained the prosecutor and the investigator, the more likely you're going to have people who are going to analyze the ocean and determine what part of the ocean it's worth boiling and which part of the ocean it's not worth boiling. And that's why I've done a lot of writing about the need to train and retain FCPA prosecutors for lengthy periods, because I believe the more well-trained you are, the more experienced you are, the longer you've been there as an FCPA prosecutor, the more you understand that where to go and where not to go. Some problems can be fixed in the main by just having a good compliance program, maybe a monitor that can monitor the activity across the world without having necessarily to scrutinize every single transaction, or having an outside counsel scrutinize every single transaction across the world. It's hard to talk about that without knowing the facts of the case, but I can tell you for sure that the more experienced the prosecutor, the more truncated and narrow that process is.
Yeah, that makes sense, and the same sort of logic applies to companies or law firms doing internal investigations and having a highly experienced partner such as yourself or others involved in the investigation, rather than having less experienced persons making those discretionary calls.
Mm-hmm.
Another recent column you wrote was about what you called sporadic enforcement by the DOJ. And in this article, you stated, quote, the current resource allocations at the DOJ's FCPA unit don't seem to provide adequate bang for the taxpayer's buck. Can you elaborate on that point, including how you might revamp the FCPA unit to best accomplish its objectives?
Sure. I'd be happy to, Mike. First of all, as resources increase within the Department of Justice and within particular sections within the department and within particular units in the department, you're able, if you're thinking proactively and organically, you're able to look at law enforcement in a more holistic way. And to some degree, all of FCPA enforcement up to this point in time has been what I would call sporadic enforcement. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that typically what we do in the FCPA unit when I was there, and I think what they're doing today, at least if the statistics bear this out, is either through an investigation or a cooperator or information coming in from some whistleblower, the DOJ will react, and I call that sort of reactive prosecution. And the DOJ will react to that, and they'll approach it, and they'll go for it, and they'll tackle each problem as it pops up. And I call that the sort of the whack-a-mole theory of prosecution, which is not bad law enforcement. It is just law enforcement in the way it happens. But as resources grow, you're able to take a longer view on how to deter and tackle the problems. And sometimes your resources are just, all you can do is whack-a-mole out there because that's all the resources you have to do. And I think that just because I say whack-a-mole, it doesn't mean it's ineffective. It just means it's just one way of tackling a problem. And I think that even though the Department of Justice has gone after certain industries, and I think by any fair margin, people understand and believe that they have been effective in changing corporate behavior in this space. But as I point out in my sporadic enforcement article, now the fraud section in the FCPA unit seem to have an amount of resources where they can actually begin to tackle the other side of the problem. And what's the other side of the problem? The other side of the problem is the bribee side, not the bribor side, because you can have 100 prosecutors tackling international bribery in a whack-a-mole space, and they will all be kept busy forever. The question is that effective and efficient use of those resources? And all I'm saying is that I believe now they have sufficient resources to start to tackle the other side of international bribery, and that is the bribe-e side. The person and the people who are receiving the bribes, and they have the sufficient resources within the criminal division to start tackling that and taking their assets. And that's part of the sort of where I'm going with that piece.
And for listeners' benefit, the FCPA is a supply-side only statute. In other words, and like you alluded to, it only seeks to capture the payor of the alleged bribe and not the recipient, the so-called demand side of what is, at the end of the day, a two-party transaction. Is what you're referring to here what the DOJ has called its asset kleptocracy initiative and the asset recovery prong of this picture?
Yeah, yes, it does. And my point in the article is that you're never going to be completely effective until you tackle both sides. And I think that the FCPA unit can, now that it has an additional 10 prosecutors, can be more effective if they begin working that side as well, along with the experience and the resources that they have in DOJ's kleptocracy unit. You know, Mike, for a long time, the DOJ has been involved in seizing assets internationally. There's a lot of institutional experience in the DOJ. It just needs to be focused. And I will tell you that there is no better agency out there than the FBI to assist in that process. They have unique tools and unique experience in these international asset recovery programs. And so, as you know, there are now 3 FCPA units that the FBI has that are specifically dedicated to recovering and dealing with international corruption. And I think that that's a huge, it's a sea change really. When I was in the fraud section, we used to have to fight and clutch and claw for FBI resources. They're ready to be equal players in this program now, and I think that to be effective and to be most effective in law enforcement in this arena, you need to join those resources and work the other side of the program as well, other side of the problem as well.
To be sure, it'll be interesting to see what happens the remainder of this year and in the near term, as just from a practical and perhaps political standpoint, the more resources a government agency has, the greater expectation is that there'll be so-called results. So no doubt an interesting space to follow, and all the points you made today are points for those interested in the FCPA space to consider. So thank you again, Mr. Pelletier, for joining us today.
I appreciate it, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.